Okay, welcome again to Conversations on the Mind. I'm your host, Dr. Denise Cook. I have a PhD in neuroscience, and I've been interested for a long time in the role of emotions in cognition. And a little bit more recently, I've taken an interest in artificial intelligence and whether we could actually design robots to have emotions. Now, when we speak of emotions, we sometimes, there's philosophers have sometimes brought up this concept of qualia. So we're going to discuss today, again with Rocco van Skalkwijk, what are qualia, and are they these mysterious entities that we cannot explain, or are they computable in some way? And can his Xzistor model, mathematical model of the mind, say something about qualia? So again, that's welcome, Rocco, to this podcast, or to this conversation on the mind. So welcome, Rocco.
Hi, Denise. Yeah, nice to be with you again. Always enjoy these chats very much, away from the day job. And certainly, qualia is an interesting one. People have been, having this discussion for years, for decades, for even more than that. And I'm keen for us to interrogate this concept a little bit using this mathematical model of mind and see if we can maybe add something new. And clarify some of the mystery around these this concept. So very happy to discuss this, and hopefully
First,
yeah.
Rocco, wait, you touched on something that I don't think we've actually brought up before to our listeners, is that you have a day job. Your Xzistor mathematical of the mind was completely designed in your spare time. This was your hobby for 25 years, correct?
That's right. Literally the hobby. Yeah, had to keep the pot boiling. So engineer by day, and then got latched onto this idea that if you use control theory, you could come up with a very interesting mathematical model of the human mind. And this progressed to the point where I suddenly realized, but here is even a basis to define how emotions work. And then how emotions tag to cognition and problem solving. And in over the years, I got to a point where I thought I had most of what happens in the brain covered. And that's why I built it into a simulation and into a little robot to test it, and it had a very positive outcome. So I'm very excited about this mathematical model of mind, and I'm keen to put it to the ultimate test and see if we can, help explain qualia, which is like one of the world's biggest problems in philosophy.
Right. Well, so it's interesting because I've when I got interested in emotions, and of course coming to this viewpoint that we each have a different world view, or how we see the world differently, and that we each have this personal subjective experience to how we see the world. And then I bump into this term called qualia, and I said, well, is it any different than subjective experience? Because they'll say something like, oh, well, how, qualia is just how does it feel like to be a bat? Can we understand what it feels like to be a bat or a snake or another organism? How do they see the world, and how is that different from how we see the world? And then you can actually expand on that, like, oh, how do I see the world compared to how you, Rocco, see the world? And can we actually come up with a model of mind that can explain those subjective differences in an objective way, let's say?
And I think that's where the Xzistor model could come in, really nicely, and try and offer that explanation. Because yes, qualia has, over the years, people have formulated it and decided to explore this mystery of what it is like to experience something and to feel something, as a subjective state. And I think when we look at the mathematical model of mind, it gives us a mechanism to look at, which we can explore a little bit. But right now, it's interesting that you should say that, because we know that we can't experience life exactly like somebody else has. We can speculate that we see red, we see blue, we have the same sort of emotional attachment to certain objects, but we can't be sure. And some of these things get quite interesting because, if you look at the snake, for instance, and you look at the sensors that the snake has, you can look at the snake and see, but the snake see red, the snake see green, and then people will do some tests and they will say, you know what, that snake doesn't experience the world like that. It can't see the colors that you see, but it has got superimposed on that heat maps of the world. So you almost see these sort of heat maps, in terms of sensory states that come in. Becomes very difficult to understand what it feels like to be that animal. And just recently, people have spoken about the antelope and the big game hunters. I'm not a hunter myself, but people tell me that they've at some stage moved from camouflage gear, clothes, to go hunting, to actually wearing blue overalls, because scientists have looked at these antelopes and see that they experience colors differently from humans. Through their eyes, the world's kind of blue. And if you really want to go unseen in their world, you must wear blue.
Mm.
So very interesting. We must not jump too quickly to the conclusion that the way we see the world or we experience it subjectively is how other animals or even systems experience the world.
And it's interesting because generally, as we're growing up, we kind of like the center of our own universe. We kind of think that everyone around us is experiencing the same thing, that like what's important to me must be important to everyone else. And this is a source of conflict and disagreement between different people as they're trying to navigate these waters of seeing the world differently, right?
Absolutely. And I mean, you get colorblind people, and you just, will grow up with somebody and all your life you'll think they understand what a red robot is, just like sorry, I say robot, that's South African term, a red traffic light is. And later on, that person might only find out later in their lives, I've tested, I'm colorblind. So what have you been seeing? You call that state that you experience red, but it's not the same because I know I'm not colorblind, and yet we both call it red. So it's become a very subjective experience, and absolutely,
Right. So they've tagged a different color or a different wavelength of light that they see because they're missing a cone or a rod, or they're missing a cone that doesn't let them see the color red, or they see the color green instead of red. And so what they're calling red is actually green to them, but they have no idea because all their life they've tagged that color that they're seeing as red.
And that's the thing, and it might be in the cones of the actual retina or the eye, or that part might even be the same. That might not be the problem. The signal might come through all the way to the brain, and then the area where this state, the sensory state, is turned into a representation in the brain that the brain can work with. Maybe that's where the error is, and then suddenly, my brain generates a slightly different representation from the other person. But we both, like you say, as we learn to associate things with that representation, we will learn. Somebody will say, "That's the red apple. Do you want the red apple or the green apple?" Oh, okay, I must get this right. That is red. And that's how
So you kind of think that you're talking about the same thing, but you never know if you actually are. People are actually tested for color blindness, and that's how they find out. They would not know otherwise.
And it's deceptive because you'll see the outside behavior you observe could be very much the same, and say, well, yes, Denise picked the red apple because she likes red apples more than green apples, and Rocco picked the red apple. But it might be that your subjective, your qualia, your perception or experience of that representation is different from mine. You can't see it from the outside. This is the interesting thing about
internal
qualia.
state. So what's actually going on in the mind is actually different, but you've tagged it with the exact same word.
That's it. So out to the outside world, it looks like those people, have got the same mechanism running, and they've got the same understanding and the same qualia, the same subjective experience. But what makes it tricky is, of course, I can't interface with how you're experiencing it.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't got a link to Denise's brain where I can say, I'm going to now bring that signal from Denise's eye into my brain. And even I could do that, there's no guarantee that the representation that forms, a spatiotemporal neural representation that gets formed in the neurons in the brain, is the same. So immediately it becomes a very private matter. And I think that's the point that people like Daniel Dennett and try to make, when they say, it's private, it's absolutely subjective. You can't give one system access to another system's qualia,
Mm-hmm.
um, for the simple reason that you can't interface. There's no connection that you can make. If you can make the connection, there's no guarantee that the representation will be the same. There's also no guarantee that the way the executive part of the brain or the system will use the same rules to interpret that incoming representation. So at best, we can look from outside and speculate whether Denise is experiencing, seeing a snake the same as I would, but we haven't got proof. And this is where we can take a little bit, maybe a cue from this mathematical model of the mind, where we say there's some mechanisms here. It explains some interesting mechanisms that can help us to understand, what qualia is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think just to go back into history a little bit.
Right. Let's just take it to step back first
Yeah.
and look at like what philosophers have debated up until now. Like there's you mentioned before when we were speaking before that there's two camps. So what can you tell me about the current view of qualia?
Yeah. So it's interesting. Over the years, the philosophers have debated this very much, and you can imagine going back a long time before we had any really tools to look inside the brain, where people would just
Right. Well,
sit
that's
under a
important to
tree.
know because like
Yeah.
neuroscience is 100 years old and we've come so far, but still a lot of that knowledge hasn't been incorporated into philosophy, has it?
It's part of the
Mm-hmm.
problem. I think you're 100%
Mm-hmm.
right. They still stuck with this philosophical approach where they sit under a tree and they do thought experiments, and basically say, well, what does it feel like to see red? What happens when you see red? What is the subjective experience of feeling, of seeing red? We have now established that we can't say there's red in the environment. Those are electromechanical frequencies that come through, that falls onto the eye, to the retina, and it creates an electrical signal. The electrical signal goes into the brain and it forms a representation, and that's where it gets tagged with associations and emotions and gets meaningful. So we've got that understanding, but in the time of the philosophers, they were really just looking up, into the sky and just speculating about what it is to see red. What is it to feel a headache? You know, what is it? And without any mechanisms or models, it became quite an issue. And I think it was David Chalmers that sort of formulated this hard problem of consciousness, which very much revolves around qualia and humans having qualia. And basically this element of, but even if you can explain all these neural mechanisms, David Chalmers still feel there's something missing. You cannot just provide all the, if you create these mechanisms, there's still something missing, which he calls experience.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this is like coming from the philosopher camp. They call it experience. There's no more detail really around what they mean with that. It's quite a vague term. And of course, there were some other philosophers that felt very strongly that it actually, if we can identify the mechanisms, of the brain adequately, it'll take away the mystery of qualia. It'll take away the mystery of what it is like to feel, to see red.
Mm-hmm.
We will find a scientific explanation of, how this process work, how the mechanism work. And there was people like Daniel Dennett and so on, which came through very strongly and said, but this is not a mystery. There's nothing here. The only thing we need to do is understand the brain better, and understand the mechanisms better, and even maybe if we can replicate those mechanisms, we will see that the same states that we want to call qualia is just generated by those mechanisms. There's nothing more needed. There's no mystery here.
Well, it's
So
interesting that you bring up experience, because in neuroscience, you can literally see how experiences changes the neurons in the brain. Like you have experiments showing that like enrichment of the environment leads to more synapses, and that's where information is flowing through the brain. So more enrichment, more synapses. You can see learning happening in the brain through long-term potentiation. And so we have all that knowledge that like, okay, well, experience is not a mystery. Experience changes the brain. That's what learning is. And this will change how you interact with your environment in the future.
100%. So we've gained quite a bit of information over the years. I mean, now they've got fMRI scans, they've got all the CT scans, they've got the photon approaches, where they really can look into the brain and see in real time, you know, how these things happen, how we build associations, how we learn. And I think perhaps what the philosophers struggle with is to understand it from a mechanistic point of view. So my model, the mathematical model of the mind, basically based on control theory and control loops, and it all comes down to control loop, negative feedback loops, and typically the homeostatic loops, that sort of thing. And if you follow that through and you build those mechanisms that can create emotions and cognition in the brain, I think this is what Daniel Dennett alluded to when he said, you know, if only we can build those mechanisms to a higher level of granularity, there's no reason why we can't generate what people call qualia. And I want to agree with that. So these two different camps: the philosophers which feel no ways, you know, it's too mysterious, even if you've got all the mechanisms.
There's still a magic sauce.
The hard problem
There's
of
still a
consciousness.
ghost in the machine
Yeah.
somewhere.
Yeah. And I think it's time that we move on from that. And I'm keen for this model of mind to just inform that and maybe offer an option for people to say, all those guys that said, well, even a computer can eventually, you know, possess qualia. If only we can identify those mechanisms clearly, reproduce them to a credible level, we should see the same thing. And that's exactly what we see with a model. So what's interesting is, I'm not claiming that the model replicates the brain in its all complexity. What we're saying is it gives a principle. It gives us a principle model, and that's enough. That's enough to explain this mysterious mechanism. And we can talk about this mechanism a little bit.
Right. So what you're saying, Rocco, is that you believe that your Xzistor model of the mathematical model of the mind can explain qualia. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I think so.
So can we work through an example maybe for our audience to show like how let's say, how does your model explain why in the morning when I need my caffeine fix and I open my cupboard, I'm always reaching for the exact same mug, and if that mug is not there one day, how like my world has ended. Can your model explain that?
So yeah, absolutely. So you've got this very subjective attraction to this mug, and maybe we just take a little step backwards.
Right.
And just
let's design a robot, a hypothetical robot in our.
Let's do that.
Simulate a
a caffeine craving robot. Yeah.
A caffeine craving robot. The only thing that this robot cares about is caffeine. All of its qualia will revolve around caffeine.
Absolutely. So the obviously what is interesting is, you just said you open the cupboard and you see your favorite mug, and immediately my model explains why that is your favorite mug. So it's become a satiation object in your life. So when you have this caffeine craving, okay, and then the model talks about UTRs, urgency to restore control loops or homeostatic mechanisms.
So what we're saying here is that I wake up in the morning and I'm caffeine deprived.
Yeah.
And you would call that the deprivation state.
That's
and I'm
correct.
Almost caffeine deprived to the level that I'm shaking. I need my caffeine fix to get through the day. And so so my level of caffeine is basically below the set point that I personally need, and I want to be bringing it back up. So I'm searching for satiation.
100%.
Yeah.
And that drives your mental state
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that we have now got a measurable parameter. We've got an entity on which we can base a homeostasis mechanism, right? So we say you are in deprivation when you need caffeine, but you haven't got caffeine. Okay. And what you would have learned through experience is when you get access to caffeine, you feel better.
Mm-hmm.
The deprivation is lowered, and that's what we call satiation, right? So, and this is important because what we say with the Xzistor mathematical model of mind is this is when you learn in a certain way called
And
operant learning.
this is
Yeah.
basically how objects in the environment will be tagged due to the satiation felt when I'm drinking a cup of coffee. So the actual mug that I'm drinking out of will become a satiation object because it also will have pleasurable feelings associated with it.
Exactly right. At that given moment, when you get the caffeine, you drink the caffeine, everything that's in your environment gets tagged with this satiation effect, and it becomes a approach effect. So because there's only information in the brain, pretty much can only be avoid or approach. And now your mug has become your blue mug, or did we say a blue mug?
Sure, let's go with blue.
Let's go with
Blue
blue.
or
So
red.
it was red. So let's say a
Mm-hmm.
red mug. Your favorite mug is a
Mm-hmm.
red mug. Now suddenly it gets tagged with the fact that it's associated with a satiation state. And this is an approach state. So in your association database, we now see there's a representation of this cup, okay? And the color is there. It's a representation of that color
Mm-hmm.
along with these positive emotions. So
The
now,
positive feelings were all derived from drinking the caffeine that first time. This would have
that's
to be
right.
go all the way back to the first time that I drank caffeine.
Yeah.
And it was a positive feeling, and that was then tagged to all of these cues.
100%. And when we say positive, it can only be the fact that you have adjusted a deprivation state.
Mm-hmm.
So
I've
there's
solved the
only
problem.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
there's only so much that can happen in the brain really,
Mm-hmm.
because it's all information. So you can reach a state where you say this is deprivation. I'm going to teach this brain to not get into that deprivation state by rewarding it when it finds a satiation source.
Mm-hmm.
So the moment way back when you drank coffee for the first time, it said, right, I'm going to reward you now through operant learning that whatever you did now, that cup, holding it in your hand, drinking it, that is the right action. And that cup becomes a satiation source. So now in the morning when you wake up, you move to the cupboard and you see the blue cup or the red cup. Let's go with the red cup.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you immediately feel this is my favorite cup. You experience a very positive feeling about that cup because that is the satiation source. Okay, and in all your emotional tagging in the association database, this is being reinforced through the all the emotional impacts, and your expectation is that this will act as a satiation source.
Right.
Um,
Right. Because now it's kind of predicting. So I have this caffeine deprivation. I see my mug. It's kind of it's leading to this pleasurable feeling that because I predict that my deprivation will be solved in the future. So it's like your brain is actually anticipating the future pleasure.
100%. So
Basically, and
so
so
as
that's what's giving that good feeling, those warm feelings towards the mug. And so that mug, so is that qualia, right?
well, I mean,
Are my warm, I'm experiencing that mug is warm and fuzzy, and to me that's my personal experience. You don't experience the same thing towards my mug.
100%, yeah. And of course, I can't know how much you enjoy your coffee. It's a very personal, very subjective
Mhm.
experience. Exactly how you experience drinking coffee. So, and it's interesting what you say about the prediction. So, with this mathematical model of mind, when you first enter into a state of deprivation, where you say, "Oops, your caffeine level is dropping low," you drop into the state, and you get this craving. The first thing that happens in your association database, you go and look for these objects, and you will literally see the cup in front of your eyes, and you'll see the kitchen, and you'll see the cupboard. Okay, because these are the associations that you've made, which will be tagged and which will be elicited by this process. And
And this
now,
is because all of those objects are not just tagged with deprivation, they're tagged with the caffeine urgency to restore as well. And so it's like, okay, I'm missing caffeine right now. What are the objects in my environment that predict that I can solve this?
exactly. So, and you can see different ones, but maybe you say it's your favorite cup. So this one will be up there immediately. And also what you also stored through your reward-based backpropagation, your learning, is what actions you should take. So that's
Yeah, so
also
that's
in the
what's really
association
interesting,
database.
right?
Yeah.
There's
So
also I need to remember the path that I take to get to my mug.
100%. And the model explains how you learn step by step to get familiar with this
Right.
path that you. So if you're in the door of the kitchen, the model explains how you will learn to go, move, turn left, go to the cupboard, open the cupboard, and look for your mug. Now, the interesting thing that you mentioned about prediction is very interesting. If you now open the cupboard and the mug is not there, you feel deprivation. So what happens is you are
But
anticipating.
it's a deprivation now. So this is important, Rocco. It's a deprivation that's not associated with the caffeine. It's a
Exactly.
deprivation that's now associated with the pleasurable feeling that I was anticipating. So now we
That's
have
right.
a homeostatic loop on top of another homeostatic loop. So
That's right.
we're at a different level here.
Exactly. So now we've got this stress level, of course, as well, which you and I understand is always part of these homeostatic loops. We
Yes.
call it allostasis. But there's always this autonomic stress state as well. So now you are vigorously walking towards the cupboard, you open the cupboard, and you think you're going to see your mug there, and you don't see it. And whereas you expected satiation, you are still in deprivation. And you are stressed now because you don't see
You don't know
immediate
where the mug is.
access
Yeah.
to satiation. And like we said, the brain just lives for satiation. So suddenly it's like, I normally expect satiation here. The satiation source is not here, and the stress level goes up, right? And this is, you and I know the model says when the stress level goes up, you start thinking,
You start
okay?
thinking, you
And
start
this is what we
searching.
call directed
Right.
threading. And
Right.
this is
And we
now where
miss
you,
something because also there will also be disappointment, right?
yeah,
So I guess stress is kind of it's a catch-all for a lot of
yeah,
different things, but the actual emotion that we will feel when confronted with a discrepancy between what we expected and what the reality is. I expected the mug to be there. I was happy. I was predicting myself to be happy when I saw the mug and it's not there, and so I feel an extreme sense of disappointment.
that's
And then, like you said, that will kind of trigger my mind to saying like, oh, where did I leave the mug the last time, or what has happened to the mug, and to try and go and sort out the problem of the mug instead of the problem of the coffee.
that becomes your focus now.
Mm-hmm.
The problem is initially get to the coffee source. Now your new priority is where's the mug? I have to find the mug, and then you do this directed threading where you say let's bring up association states that could lead me to the mug.
So
Or
when you say association state, I know we've been using the word, but it's basically memories. It's
it's
basically,
basically memories.
we're
Yeah.
talking about how the urgency to restore plus the emotion and the motor actions, which we've mentioned before, and the cue, and the object kind of get tagged together, so associated together into, you would call it a representation, or each individual representation, a memory.
Yeah, the representations that are linked together.
Together,
And
right.
it actually is just exactly as the name says. It's an association.
Right.
So all those
And in your model, in your actual robots, these create line items in a database.
It's a database, it's
Yeah.
line items, and it's
Mm-hmm.
literally, obviously, these representations take a computational format in this case. No problem with that. It could be a 110111 or anything like that. The robot brain knows what to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is the key thing about qualia, is you present it with a state, and the executive part knows what to do with that. It follows rules. It might be slightly different rules from what's followed by the human brain, but it's principally the same. So you've got an association, a long list of things, and it's tagged in specifically good, bad emotions, the stress states, all those things are, and then also, like you said, the emotions, the actual motion, effector motion. What
Mm-hmm.
must you do? What must you do in this case? So what actions must you take? And literally by running in the right way through these associations, you get the behavior that you see in humans as well. You know, you see the robot develop his caffeine craving. You see it
Mm-hmm.
gets fidgety, agitated. Then you see it starts aiming for the cupboard because it's learned. You've taught it to go to the cupboard. And then interestingly, most of the time, the coffee cup will be there and the robot will
Mm-hmm.
drink the coffee and feel better. And
that keeps the association kind of alive, the emotional tagging, because you have a repetition feature. So the more something's repeated, the more likely you are to do it the next time, to go from deprivation to satiation.
100%.
Mm-hmm.
The association gets weighted by
Mm-hmm.
what is recent. So you might have had another favorite coffee cup 2 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
but because that was in another house at another time, you don't use it anymore. That sort of fades a little bit in the association database in terms of its impact factor. And it'll come to mind occasionally when you run through the context algorithm, and you will remember it again if you see something close. But right now, when you are trying to solve a problem, the stuff that's up front in the association database, the most highest impact factor will be the most recent,
Right.
most repeated, and the ones that had the most emotional impact.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in our case, when we talk about emotional impact, finding caffeine and getting satiated by caffeine, these are emotions. Not
Mm-hmm.
having caffeine is a negative emotion because we program it like that. Finding caffeine, satiation, is a positive emotion because we program it like that. In this little robot's mind, caffeine is all that really exists. So it's a nice sort of simple way. Obviously, when we add in all the other emotions, thirst, hunger, fatigue, pain, and all these other things, we get something more closer to the human mind. But it's a
Right,
good
becomes more
example.
complex. But yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
But for our purposes, we're discussing just the caffeine
yeah.
obsessed robot.
And experiencing
Right,
this very personal
right.
state. And
And
just to
what's
add,
interesting to me, Rocco, is that we mentioned disappointment. We mentioned the emotion of disappointment, but these emotions like disappointment, fear, they're not actually pre-programmed into the robot. They're kind of, I like to say emerge, but they come from having the homeostatic loop and having the satiation and the deprivation, and having you also have like an internal sensation of what each emotion feels like, right?
yeah.
And you've
And
never coded, you don't have to code for disappointment, you don't have to code for fear. That kind of
i-
emerges from the experience of the robot.
and I'm tempted to say, if you develop a brain model
Mm-hmm.
and you have to code for those things, you're on the wrong path. You know what I mean? You can't
Mm-hmm.
put every single emotion in a little bin and
No.
give it a name. That's not the way to go. It's better to say you put the basics in place, you put the homeostatic loops in place, you enable the robot to learn from experience, to build associations, and then tag these emotions as the robot experiences life. Objects, the representation of objects gets tagged with these very subjective emotions for that robot. Um, and that gives meaning to the whole robot's life. So now suddenly when it looks at objects, it's all about, is that going to help me to get caffeine, or is that going to block me from getting caffeine?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and obviously that's a simplification, but that's exactly, and you use the word emergence, and I'm always
Mm-hmm.
very careful when I use that because
Right.
people get confused
Yeah.
and they get into philosophy, and
Well, it's like,
evolution.
is there, what we're seeing in the robot more than the sum of its parts, basically?
Yes, and that's also an interesting question, because in this case it's very I think helpful to use the word emergence, because what we do with this model is we set up a few base rules and a few basic mechanisms, but all the great stuff happens through emergence. So I say, you can get feel deprived, you can get into a deprivation state, you will learn, you will form associations, and I put the rules down, and then I put the little robot in environment and say, you go for it. When you feel a craving for caffeine, start crying. I will help you. I'll take you to the caffeine source, and there we go.
And what's interesting is that you're actually explaining how objects in the environment come to form meaning for the robot, right? Everything for the robot that we're talking about today, everything in its environment derives meaning from, is it will it help me get caffeine, or will it prevent me from getting caffeine? So they will be tagged with positive or negative emotions based on, how useful are these objects in getting me the caffeine.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about this model is really it also explains how it is that we feel emotions subjectively. So it also gives you an explanation of why the robot would feel that emotion subjectively. So in other words, it'll be an actual feeling, and the robot will learn over time, theoretically, to say, I feel hungry, I feel the need for coffee, that feels good, I'm happy, I'm sad. The model explains how this comes about, and this is all about emergence. And people struggle with this model because they think it's too simple to give rise to all the complexity we need, to really compare it with a human. But then I always say, go and look at a baby at birth, and how simple it is. And any behavior or any mystifying, sort of abilities of the baby that you don't see on day one at birth, that must come about by learning. So, we do the same with this model. We set the robot up to be basically receptive and ready to build association and learn. And then through emergence, we get these associations where the emotions are tagged. And we don't have to code for specific emotions, for specific states. We just let the robot learn. And all that's important is the basic mechanisms and the rules. And the next thing you see is, well, this robot has learned to navigate to the cupboard and find the coffee. Oh, look, it's got a smile on its face. It actually enjoys the coffee, and we explain how that state comes about.
Right, because you've actually been able to encode, a feeling state that can be expressed by the robot to us humans. You can actually encode, okay, like when the robot is in this kind of state, it has a smile on its face. And so you can actually see, as an outsider,
that
the robot is kind of signaling to you what its internal state is, just as a human would do.
Yeah, and it's important to understand that the smile is not the emotion. In fact, in this model, a smile is just a reflex. It's just, it's all about that internal state. And the model explains that internal emotional state, how that representation is generated, that avoid state and that approach state, and how it is presented to the executive part of the brain as such. And then the smile or the frown just becomes a reflex that taps off of that. So I'm not the smile and the frown and all those things, expressions on the robot's face, very helpful. But the real, I think, innovative bit is the actual explanation of this is a mechanism.
What the emotions are.
Yeah, it's got qualia. It feels like you and I, and the robot will eventually self-report. It will look you in the eye and say, I love the taste of coffee. I enjoy it. I feel happy. I feel unhappy when I haven't got coffee. These are the self-reporting phrases we should expect if the robot keeps on learning, keeps on learning, keeps on learning, because of the rules and those base mechanisms that is part of the model.
Right. Okay. So I wanted to go a little bit more into the disappointment and what the robot would do, but maybe that's going a little bit too long here. So let's just we'll move on to question I have in the back of my mind is, so, I don't know if you've seen the movie Inception, but the guys go in and they try and, you know, uh, they go into someone's mind and they implant a false memory. And so you're saying that what qualia are like the robot has a homeostatic feedback loop, and then it forms this association database, and that association database is tagged with emotion or how what it is like to be that robot, or how the robot senses the mug, right?
Yeah.
What it's like for the robot to look at this mug. Now, can you actually go into this association database and plant a false memory and try and make it, can you make it fall in love with a blue mug instead of the red mug?
Well, that's interesting, and that makes it really fun to work with this mathematical model, because of course you can take a little look around inside the association database, and I have a little button on my robot which I push, one single button, and then the whole database gets exported into a file, and then you can literally scroll through it, and what you see how these qualia states get registered. So when I look at my robot and I teach my robot to react to something that's red, let's say the red mug for now, you go in the association database, you don't see the color red. You see an encodement, a representation, maybe 110111, and something like that could be the representation of red, right? So red as a color, as a phenomenon, as a frequency of electromagnetic waves doesn't enter. The sensor has translated that into RGB, and then, by some rule, change it into ones and zeros. But it is uniquely derived from what the sensor sees. So there you have what the robot is in the robot's mind in terms of a representation of a sensory state. And then the next thing you see in the following columns of the association database is all these emotional taggings, in terms of the different UTRs, urgency to restore mechanisms, and also the level of deprivation, the level of satiation, and then finally also the motions that was learned at that time when the association was formed. You were doing this. This is good. That's why it feels good. Now, what I can do is, what I have done is to now also just see for the blue mug, what is the qualia state, or the sensory, the subjective representation in the database. So I put a blue mug in front of the robot, and I see, it's this time it's 00111100 is generated as the representation for that color in the robot's brain. So now you can be naughty, and you can actually take all the learning that has been going on associated with the red mug and link it to the blue mug. Okay.
Right.
So as if in his life he's actually learned exactly the same stuff, and you do it in a whisk, in a copy paste exercise.
Right, exactly. Just copy paste all the 0111s and paste in the representation of the blue mug. And so, like, now you can say, like, you can kind of give it experience that it never had.
Never had, exactly right. And I often use this to build phobias into the robot. So I take a bit of pain from one area where I knew it experienced some pain, and I build it into something else and just see what happens. Let's give it a fear of darkness, right? If it sees darkness, I pinch those fear states, and I paste it into this, and it works perfectly. So it's interesting. Now your caffeine-seeking robot arrives at the cupboard, open the cupboard, and there's a red mug and a blue mug, and without having had any subjective experience of life experience around the blue mug, it will experience exactly the same qualia, exactly the same subjective state as if it looks at the red mug. So here we understand the mechanism, and it'll look at the red mug and the blue mug, and it'll be confused.
Right, because here it's experiencing the red mug and the blue mug as having an equal emotional value.
Exactly. The states will be identical effectively.
Mm-hmm.
So you've just copy and pasted it from
Right.
the red one,
Okay,
pasted it to
onto
the
the
blue
blue
one,
one. Okay.
instantaneously identical. And you'll see an interesting state now where suddenly it will feel for the robot as if it has spent a lifetime using the blue mug as
Mm-hmm.
well, equally attracted. And it'll associate the blue mug as a satiation source, a good thing. And it'll be an approach behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So the emotion will be, this is something that has solved my deprivation in the past. Um, it is very meaningful from that point of view, because
Mm-hmm.
the only thing that's got meaning in my life is caffeine.
Right.
So
So then that's
yeah,
another interesting point, is that like you haven't encoded confusion into your robot, and now you have a confused robot just simply by making the impact factor of both objects the exact same.
yes, and that's so interesting, because that's why I feel this model is so very helpful in understanding
Mm-hmm.
the human brain, because we also sometimes get into a situation like that where things just add up and they're almost the same, and you end up being ambivalent.
Mm-hmm.
And you look at, this, and I think what will happen immediately as the robot looks at the red mug and the blue mug, it'll start to thread, and like we've discussed, and it'll bring up context
Mm-hmm.
around those colors. And probably what will sway in the end, the robot reaching for one mug rather than the other, could be the context states that gets generated. So as you look at the one, red, traditionally maybe he has learned something around blood, or some negative emotions around that. Maybe with blue, he's maybe learned that he can go to the seaside, and blue is a nice color, and the ocean, and so
Right. So now he's not just looking at the memories associated with caffeine and what he does when he needs
Mhm,
caffeine. He's looking
mhm,
further into his association database because he hasn't been able to solve his caffeine mug
mhm.
problem, to look if there's any other cues that can help him decide between the two.
He's
Is
now
that right? Yeah.
he's now threading. So
He's now going
obviously,
kind of deeper and deeper into the association because like
yeah, we must be careful. We
yeah.
must be careful, because we have defined a
Mhm.
robot that only lives for caffeine.
Right.
So when we look at the association database, we will not find anything of value other than is related to caffeine.
Right.
So you're not going to see a seaside holiday have any
Mhm.
meaning unless it is
This
the
is
place where I drank
right.
some really good coffee. Yeah. And
Right.
red will not be associated with blood, because it doesn't worry about blood unless blood was
Mhm.
avoiding it from getting to caffeine.
Mhm.
But it's still
Okay.
helpful to just understand
Mhm.
on that moment, as it contextualizes, the blue might trigger a different threading path, or a different chain of associations,
Mhm.
all with their emotional tagging, which could sway the robot either for or against using that mug. And that slight emotional bias could then make the robot reach for the red cup rather than the blue cup.
So that's
Um,
interesting what you brought up about the beach holidays not having seaside holidays not having any meaning unless there was a cup of coffee there. And so this what it means is that all of our emotions are formed or being tagged to experience based on what they provide in terms of approaching or avoiding caffeine in this case.
in this
And so
case, and
there's
in you,
so
yeah.
all of our emotions are being formed based on these homeostatic loops. Obviously, we just don't have caffeine, we have many. But
Hmm.
without these homeostatic loops, there would be no emotions, there would be no emotion tagging, there would be no emotion database.
There will be no meaning.
No
There will be
meaning.
no
Okay.
meaning, because
Right.
objects or sensory states only get
Mm-hmm.
meaning in terms of our homeostatic loops, which gives us our preferences, and it gives us intent.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us need to do things, and everything in the environment then becomes meaningful in the sense of, how does this either provide me with satiation or prevents me from enjoying
Mm-hmm.
satiation? So you look at the
So
beach
exactly.
holiday.
So I think that
Mhm.
is the key here, is that what the philosophers have been missing in the past is like, where does meaning come from? How do objects become meaningful? And it's this exact thing. It's these homeostatic, or this is what you would say. It's these
Yeah,
homeostatic control loops that are that's what's grounding experience. That's what's giving meaning.
exactly. It sounds quite harsh, but it
Mm-hmm.
really, in my model, there's nothing else that really gives meaning. It gets complex, because it all gets, like you say, emergent over time. It gets a very rich experience because we don't only have caffeine. We've got stress, fatigue, all these things. A beach holiday to you and me has got a lot to do with de-stressing from a work environment. So the frustrations of a work environment, the possible interpersonal stresses that you have at work, and now you go on a holiday and you relax, you get away from all of that, and that's satiation. Literally, that's satiation from the fight or flight reflex that's associated with this workplace stress. But it's still a UTR. It's still a deprivation, satiation situation. And there's your beach holiday, very meaningful to Denise because this is where I de-stress. But and so for all these homeostatic loops all together, that forms our rich experience and why things have got meaning at all. Obviously, for our little robot, caffeine is the only thing. I know people like that only live for caffeine. But yeah, it's interesting.
Okay, so that's, I guess we can lead into the end here. And so what do you want people to kind of remember from this talk? What is the main conclusion? Like your hypothesis here is that the Xzistor mathematical model of the mind explains qualia. And so what are your final thoughts on that?
I would invite people to just take a little look at this model. And the reason for that is there's been these two camps of philosophers. The guys that say, if you put all the mechanisms in place to explain this, if that was possible, you're still going to miss something, some magical ingredient to really explain why we get that feeling, that intensely subjective feeling of I'm seeing a red, I'm feeling a headache, I'm, this is my cup, this is how I feel, my cup is so special to me. There are those guys that say they always miss that the mystery element. And there's the Daniel Dennett's of the world and the Marvin Minsky's and quite a few other philosophers, which says, if you can replicate those mechanisms, if you can understand the brain, the logic of the brain well enough, and you can replicate those mechanisms and put them to work like in the human brain, everything we see, everything we experience will be the same for that system. Now, obviously, we're not saying we can experience the qualia that somebody else is experiencing or other system is experiencing, because obviously we have our own senses. We haven't got access to that signal path that the other person has. Also, there's no guarantee that the representation created in the other person or the system's brain is the same as ours. And finally, there's no guarantee that the executive part of my brain will process exactly the same the information that is represented in the brain. And we don't have to go there. So what I'm proposing with this mathematical model of the mind is we can now lift the hood on this mystery and basically say, in front of us is the mechanism of how qualia is generated. Let's stop trying to philosophize as to whether we can interchangeably or interactively experience each other's qualia, because that's not going to happen. What we can do is we can now explain the mechanism. And here we have a model which says, okay, there's a sensor. There's a parameter in the environment that affects the sensor. The sensor will generate a state which will be passed on through a signal system. It'll move through the signal system. It'll change. The parameter is not a parameter anymore. It's now an electrical signal or similar. This enters the brain and it creates a representation, a representative state, spatiotemporal neural state, neurons firing. And the executive part of the brain knows how to work with this. The moment you have something like red in the environment, just the frequencies coming in on the eye, it creates a representative state in the brain. And now, as we learn, we make associations, and somebody tells us, hey, that is red. We hear the word red, and it gets associated on that moment with that state in the brain. Okay, and that's what an association is. Representation of red in the brain the word representation, the noise comes into the brain, they get linked together. And now you can look somebody in the eye and say, I see red. Okay. That's all that is necessary and sufficient to explain how that system has arrived at experiencing qualia. And this is what this model can teach us. And we must stop looking at the mystery of, well, I cannot understand what's happening inside Denise's brain. I cannot understand what's happening inside my thermostat in my kitchen's brain. I cannot understand what's happening in Troopy's brain, although I can take a look in the association database and see some representation of what's happening in his mind and fiddle with that. But I don't really still understand the substrate, the computational substrate, which belies Troopy's subjective representational states. And that makes it interesting. So here we have a mathematical model of mind which can just explain the mechanism of qualia. There's no more mystery. What the people have said, if it's possible, it will explain.
Rocco, you think that you've fully explained on a principle level the mechanisms required to have a mind, basically.
I would go with that. I'm happy to take some challenges and take some questions. But I think.
But what I think is really important to say is that, like, you've provided an objective way to understand subjective experience, and I think that is the key here. That the math is objective. Like, you have a homeostatic loop, you have a need, a concern, or whatever. Like, you need caffeine, or you need sleep, or you need food to survive, and that all the rest comes from experience, right? And how the objects in our environment relate to those homeostatic loops, and whether they can help us survive, or or if they're going to be detrimental to our survival.
100%. And if you look at nature, you know what, Denise? Why would you design a system in any other way? Isn't that the perfectly sensible way to design something that needs to survive in an environment? And just say, well, let's take stock of what you're going to need. You're going to need food. You're not going to need water. You're going to avoid pain. We want to limit fatigue. We need some sexual arousal, for the procreation to take place. We need, what are you going to need? And put them into homeostatic loops, and then say, well.
And then you just have approach and avoid behaviors. If you look at any of our behaviors, you just have those two.
If you do something right, you get rewarded. It goes to memory in the association database, along with this emotional state, which allows you to, in future, see objects and say, that's good for me. I like the beach holiday. Coffee is good for me. I don't want to climb the mountain. I don't like the heights. That's bad for me. I don't want to go there. It gives meaning to your life. Right. This is the perfect way to build a system to operate in this way. And I think, once again, I feel that the model shows that, what is necessary and sufficient. And like qualia, words like consciousness, and things like understanding and meaning, all these things. Now, suddenly, when you lift the hood and you look at this model, you say, okay, philosophically, maybe we've been making this all too mysterious. If we look carefully at these mechanisms, there is a legitimate explanation. All of the things that's been so mysterious.
And it seems like they're all the same, right? Consciousness, qualia is all emotion, is all subjective experience. How we are subjectively moving through, or subjectively experiencing the world as we're moving through it.
Exactly. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of emotions. And it's very intriguing, because people feel emotions are like qualia, so intense, it's so subjective, so personal, and yet it's only information, and the model very nicely explains how, yes, it is only a representation, it is only a state in the brain, but how it comes that subjectively experienced, it is so intense, and it fits in with all the other systems, and it gives us this emotional tagging, which accounts for all the subtle emotions in all its subtlety, and all the different combinations that gives this sort of rich experience that you and I have of life. It's all explained there. So I guess it's a mouthful, but
Yeah.
I would say thanks for the opportunity to share again.
Mhm.
I would encourage people to take a look at this Xzistor mathematical model of mind. See whether I'm right, see whether I'm wrong.
Definitely.
Happy
Yes.
to take
Yes.
some criticism or some ideas. But thanks again, Denise. Fascinating topic, this qualia.
Thank you, Rocco. Thank you for joining us. And that's going to conclude our conversations of the mind for today on can the Xzistor mathematical model of the mind explain qualia? Rocco says yes. I say that I definitely agree, that I think that I am quite taken by his model, that I have, it also matches up with a lot of the research that I've done in the past. And it's up to the audience. Do you think that Rocco has explained this mysterious word that people call qualia? And I will leave that here. You can think about it. You can also look more into, we'll add some links at the bottom here for papers and our past talks on the Rocco's mathematical model of the mind if you want to learn more. And you can also ask any questions and we will answer them for you. So thank you very much. Goodbye, Rocco.
Thanks, Denise. And looking forward to some feedback from the viewers. Keen to get their thoughts. Thanks again. Good chat.
Thanks, Rocco.